We have a specific definition of innovation. We define innovation as value-creating novelty. And so when we talk to companies about innovation, we help them identify that novelty by itself is not innovation. You have to tie that to creating value for customers. And then as we look at creating value for customers, we look at whether or not you're creating radical new sources of value, incremental sources of value, or breakthrough sources of value. And that's the primary focus of innovation. We developed the Innovation Scorecard to help leadership of medical technology companies engage in the policy discussions and debates that will drive the reimbursement and the regulatory approval of medical technologies across various countries. Because the leadership needed to have objective measures of innovation for those discussions so they could ground those discussions in actual measures of innovation that are fact-based, so they could then get changes in the reimbursement and regulatory approval process. One of the things you find when you create an innovation scorecard, especially as you do it as we did with 5 pillars and 10 different dimensions, is that it forces you to look beyond a single silver bullet measure of innovation. And so what we find with the scorecard is that different countries have strengths in various areas. So there's no one country that leads in all areas. So when looking at Europe, for example, Europe is clearly the leader when it comes to regulatory approval process. They approve technologies faster, in a lower cost, more predictable, faster environment. So that's an area of leadership for Europe. However, an area of weakness in Europe when it comes to issues such as product distribution, with all the different languages, different countries, different distribution networks, that becomes a real cumbersome issue, as does reimbursement, because you have different payment systems across various different countries. So the US, for example, leads in reimbursement and distribution. When it comes to innovative talent and the growth of research and development capabilities within countries, publications, and in leading journals, clearly the US leads, but what's interesting is that China now has eclipsed nearly all European countries in their focus on research and development, innovation, publishing of innovative articles and leading academic journals, and also the emergence of their academic institutions among the world's top 500. So what we're trying to understand is not just where countries are today, but also their trajectory of where they're going tomorrow. And from that perspective, we have many concerns about the US, who had been a dominant power in that. Not that they're no longer going to be an important and dominant power in medical technology innovation, but that their lead over other countries is diminishing with time. And in some areas, such as regulatory approval, which are critical components to enabling technology to get into the market, the US has lost so much ground over the last 5 years that it's started to impact the amount of venture capital funding for startup companies. It's started to impact the formation of startup companies in the United States. And we see over 75% of all companies in the United States coming to Europe to get approval first, which means they're getting their first sales in Europe, which means they're coming up with the second generation products in Europe. And so it continues to put the US at a competitive disadvantage because of the regulatory process. The big weaknesses for Europe are going to fall into a couple of, I would say, 4 categories, and some of these I've mentioned previously. But one is that the reimbursement process here is so difficult, and in fact, it does not lead itself towards value-based reimbursement. Okay, so you've got different governments that provide a fixed amount of funding for a period of time, and there's no incentive to actually provide more services at the same level of funding, which means that we're not looking for cost-saving solutions. Whereas in the United States, the entire focus right now is around value-based payments, and so solutions have to deliver new sources of value, not just clinical value, but economic value as well. And I don't see enough economic value orientation in Europe to drive that type of innovation. So that's one issue. The other issue is that, and this is a cultural issue that's been developed over centuries, so it's not going to change anytime soon. But Europe is not nearly as entrepreneurially oriented as the United States or as the BRIC countries. So when you look at where innovation comes from in medical technology, it comes from startup companies. So those countries that have the most startup companies, the most venture capital to fund those companies, and the easiest market access for those technologies within the market will be the most successful in innovation. So when we look at Europe, we don't see nearly the level of entrepreneurial dynamism in these countries as we see in China, Brazil, India, the United States, Israel. Okay? We also don't see the level of venture capital and angel funding in these various markets like we see in the United States. And without that type of funding, you can't develop a good ecosystem for innovation in medical technology. And as we've worked with various companies and organizations throughout Europe on this, it's a real challenge. I mean, there's no easy answers to how you fix the funding shortfall and the cultural bias against innovation and against failure. One interesting anecdote. When I talk to venture capitalists in the United States, they'll oftentimes say things like, I would not fund a CEO for a startup company who hasn't failed at least 3 times before. When I come to Europe, they say, I would never fund anybody who's ever failed before. So you have this understanding and appreciation culturally in America that failure is part of innovation, and that failure needs to be viewed as a critical component of future success and needs to be forgiven. Whereas in Europe, we have this cultural bias against failure, a lack of forgiveness of failure, and then a lack of willingness to invest in people who have learned through failure. When we look at groundbreaking innovations in the medical technology area, we tend to put them into a couple of different categories. So from a regulatory perspective, medical technology includes molecular diagnostics, okay? It includes information technology or software, as well as what we normally think about when we talk about medical technology, which are metal and plastics and prosthetics, as well as electromechanical with regards to implantables and things like that. So on the information technology side, we are very excited about mobile health technologies because mobile health technologies have the ability to become pervasive throughout all medical technology so that you end up having implantable devices that speak to your iPhone. And then by speaking to the iPhone, it then speaks to the cloud. And by going to the cloud, it then goes to doctors and whatnot. So you have this ability now with mobile health technologies to connect traditional medical technologies with a much larger ecosystem in an interoperable sense. And I'm on the board of the Continua Health Alliance, which creates standards for mobile health interoperability. So we're very excited about what mobile health can do in that sense. Also, the most personal technology you will ever own in your life is a mobile phone. And a smart mobile phone is even more personal. And as a result of that, it's with you all the time. You may forget your car keys, you may forget your children, you may forget your wife, you never forget your phone. And so by having this very personal device, it actually becomes an important part of behavior modification. And in healthcare, we know that 75% of all the healthcare costs are associated with 25% of the people and about 5 diseases. And the problem with that cost, so 75% of the cost is really around bad behaviors, because it's associated with obesity and diabetes and congestive heart failure, which really are the result of too little activity, eating too much, and not taking your medication. So if we want to go after the largest costs in healthcare, we have to change people's behaviors. And the mobile technology is shown to be a very effective tool at changing behaviors because it's always with you. You can use it to real-time active monitoring of different vital signs and other activities that you're involved in. And then also we can send you messages and we can contact you and provide other sort of intelligent software solutions to help reinforce behavior modification. So mHealth for us is an exciting area, lots of potential. Molecular diagnostics is another very exciting area because molecular diagnostics now has the ability to transform the way that we think about medications and which patients will benefit from which medications. So we've done several different case studies around molecular diagnostics and how they're enabling much more targeted and pinpointed diagnosis, but also treatment associated with that. And then what you see is you see medical device companies and pharmaceutical companies integrating molecular diagnostics into their entire solution set. So we give a case study in one of our reports with Merck Sirona, where Merck Sirona has a molecular diagnostic that weeds out all the patients that will not benefit from their drug. And so now you have this population of patients that you know will benefit from the drug, as opposed to the traditional approach, which is half will not. And so now you can focus on those patients and get much better outcomes. You look at what GE Healthcare is doing now in molecular diagnostics. So they're combining molecular diagnostics with their imaging technology now to have two fact points now with regards to what the patient's disease is, how the patient should be treated with the disease. And so you create a much more robust system for diagnosing and treating disease with molecular diagnostics. And now with the genome and the cost of sequencing dropping so dramatically, it was over $1 billion a few years ago. It's now around $3,000 today. Within 5 years, the expectation is it'll be $100 per patient per full sequencing of the genome. So with that genetic information becoming so inexpensive, you're going to be able to use that information in a much more robust sense from a molecular diagnostic perspective. And then the last area of traditional medical devices, there's lots of different technologies being developed, but the bottom line is they're all getting faster, smaller, cheaper. And as a result of that, it actually changes the way that you go about doing things. And I'll give you one simple example. The traditional medical device approach to testing your blood sugar levels is using a glucometer, and you prick your finger and you get the blood and you put it in the device and it gives you a reading. Now, we can connect those things wirelessly with mHealth. That's interesting. We can share it with lots of people. But there's other interesting ways to go about doing this, which are now being developed in lots of different dimensions. So some people are developing the ability to actually do a glucometer test with your tears. Okay, so you don't have to prick your finger anymore. You can just cry. All right. Some people are looking at how you can actually put a small tattoo on your skin. And the tattoo, when you put a fluorescent light over it, will actually light up a certain way based upon your blood sugar levels. Okay? And if you don't put the light on it, you can't see the tattoo at all. Right? So you can use that as an approach. Others are looking at a implantable device that you can actually put underneath the skin that will be monitoring your glucose levels on a real-time basis and sending them wirelessly to your smartphone and then to the cloud and then to your healthcare providers. So we have a way that we've managed blood glucose levels now for decades, which really hasn't changed in decades. And now we see this explosion of different sort of opportunities to do the same thing in much more innovative ways, which are much less painful, more real-time, and more effective.